When people try and ask for what it is that we do, we started in a really interesting space several years ago, three-dimensional scanning, right? So we found that we're a little bit fed up with two-dimensional photos, looking at, warped wide-angle images or properties, and we wanted to just see if we could actually virtualize that space and create somewhat of a portal for people to jump inside and walk around as if they were physically there. And then along the way, we started to discover the value of this data. It's now actually recognized as spatial data. And really, it can actually also change the way that we can connect with the physical world in a human way, not just virtually. And so then I think the next thing that we've seen really break into the mainstream has been augmented reality, right? AR. And it's definitely a lot more than Pokemon Go is today. It's come a long way. It's now actually integrated and embedded within Google Maps. It's changing the way that we can navigate and perceive and extract information from the world around us. And then we have tools like virtual reality, which hopefully everyone in this room has had a chance to try. If not, now's the time, where we can effectively use this as a vessel to transport us to a new world. It's unlocking what feels like used to be constrained to our imagination. We can now actually literally experience anything. And then lastly, that future horizon that we're working towards is something known as mixed reality, smart glasses, a little bit more than Google Glass, right? So it's actually embedding seamlessly digital media in the space around you, and it's giving you a more human way to interact with it. So there's a few devices in the market currently. We've got the Microsoft HoloLens and the Magic Leap. We actually have one downstairs. If you haven't tried it, come check it out. And it's definitely something that isn't here yet, but it's moving really fast, right? You've got Apple CEO Tim Cook. He really sees mixed reality and AR being as transformative to our human experience as the smartphone has been, and we're really excited to be exploring that together. So I guess why I feel I'm here today sharing my story with you is to demystify a few things, right? So when we often start talking about what it is that we do with virtual and augmented reality, the first response we generally get is, oh, that's like that episode in Black Mirror, right? And unfortunately, that's a lot of the stigma that we have, and I think understandably so, right? Things like social media and gaming addiction are not to be taken lightly. And we're really just discovering how these tools are impacting us in the long term. And so at least what we try and do as a company on a cultural level within us is we actually try and think about how these tools can be used for good. And so I have a few examples that we're running through today, and we really have a long-term mission effectively to see if we can actually connect and inspire through 1 billion impactful immersive experiences. Cool. And so for us, our journey really kind of flipped. We were working in real estate, and then we had a moment to actually work with virtual reality and take it to a young woman in hospital. And at the time, her father reached out and he said, do you think we could actually transport her outside, help her escape from her environment in a way? She'd been in hospital for 8 weeks. And then we brought in a really basic kind of VR experience, but we saw instantly in that moment the power of the medium, right? It can literally transport you out of the most undesirable circumstances. And so then we started thinking about how we could actually focus and target it and harness this energy in a way, and not to reinvent the wheel, but how could tools like virtual reality actually help augment and scale some existing therapies. So we have 2 VR research projects that we've been working on, one out of the Royal Children's at the Peter Mac Research Institute, and that's just looking at engagement and how potentially VR can be used to reduce pain and anxiety for people in hospital. But then also we're looking on the other side around simulation. How can we actually take these VR headsets outside of the hospital and use it to help patients get more familiar with the patient journey before they step foot inside the hospital? And so what we found now is that VR is actually a bit of a catalyst for some social connections where the patients are taking them to schools, they're sharing them with their friends, their parents have a greater empathic understanding of what they're going through, and effectively it's helping reduce a lot of the treatment costs and improving the recovery time as well. So there's lots to come in that space. And then lastly, in terms of the VR space, so last year I was at a VR conference called Oculus Connect in the US, and this is actually where I got this shirt from. If you can't read it, it says the time is now. And we've been in the VR space for 6 years now, and we've definitely been riding the roller coaster, right? We've sort of, invested our heart and soul in, and unfortunately at times it hasn't really manifested, as grand as we would have envisioned. But definitely last year, I truly believe that it was the tipping point for virtual reality. We have these two VR headsets that you can see on the screen, which is an Oculus Go and an Oculus Quest. And what these two devices can do is really just run without the need for a computer. You can put it on and instantly be jumping into these virtual worlds. And we're really excited now with the accessibility of these new devices that we're actually working on a new project that will be coming out later in the year, which is actually going to really help us scale some of our missions in terms of VR impactful experiences. So there's much more to come for that. And so I want to shift the focus now to a little bit more of the data and the technology behind the scenes, right? So when we started with 3D scanning, we're effectively, starting from the bottom of this image here, base reality, this weird space that we're all sharing here in this material plane. But then what we've started to do is to virtualize it, right? So we've managed to 3D scan it and create, a digital clone of the space. And so that's really good if you're, say, planning a holiday or you're preserving an heritage site. But then what we've recently uncovered is that you can actually connect and align those two worlds together and then unlock and augment new layers of data and information within the real world. And so the best way that I can explain that is actually through a video that Facebook Reality Labs have put out. And so they call this a real-world index. And there's many companies working in a similar space. But the way that it works is it starts with raw data, right? Our phones now are constantly collecting information through computer vision. And so through these new sensors that are in the devices, they can actually create 3D maps of spaces and then actually also understand how they change through time. So we're using data and technology to look at patterns, but then also create these blueprints or these kind of artifacts, a snapshot of time, effectively like a memory of sorts. And so the quality now is really elevating quite far to the point where the data can actually permeate through the devices that we have on our smartphones. And so we see this really transforming the way that we navigate and pull out information. Maybe, for instance, going through a zoo or a museum and looking at an artifact and then having more context come from that object just simply by looking at it as something that's really exciting. And then lastly is really the ability to connect. How can we feel more presence than necessarily being trapped in the windows of our smartphone, right? Cool. And so that's a really great conceptual video, but what we wanted to do was to see how achievable this was in 2019. So last year we were working with Melbourne University, their digital and data team, and we've been 3D scanning with this Matterport camera the Melbourne School of Design for the last 4 years. And so on one hand, you can kind of get a snapshot of how it looks, but we can also now understand, like you saw previously, how this environment could actually change through time. And so we've been building out some really interesting software that can help connect and align our smartphone with these physical environments. And then you can start to reveal, almost like invisible layers of information, right? So you can go back and see, a renovation that's taken place, or you might look into the future at, a new construction site that might be underway and then envision what that's going to look like. And then beyond that, you have additional capacity. So you can imagine, the workforce of the future, they want to look at, the plumbing underground, so you know what you're about to drill into if you're performing maintenance work. And then things like wayfinding. Anyone who's navigated through a university campus or, a large shopping center indoors, wayfinding is a nightmare. This kind of technology is just working on a consumer phone without even the need for GPS now. And so it's an exciting kind of glimpse in terms of where this is heading. It's not fully, mass market yet, but functionally it works, which is really exciting. And so this is something that we're really keen to drive forward, especially with things like real-time data. So you can see here an IoT sensor where we're now actually envisioning and visualizing the heat map and how it might change through different spaces. So in terms of the practical side, there's obviously some great utility, but then beyond that, we want to look at, the art, self-expression, entertainment. And so we've been working with the street artist Roan for the last several years, indexing and archiving his exhibitions. If you haven't heard of him, he's basically the Banksy of Australia. And so we were working with him and Apple, and we created an experience called Antecedent. And the way that it worked really simply is it actually ran 12 months before the exhibition opened. And so inside this old Great Gatsby-style mansion, Burnham Beaches, out in the Dandenongs, we did a 3D scan of the space. And then you could actually see before and after in terms of how the space has changed. And so a lot of visitors would come through and they'll be like, that's a nice mural that he painted on the wall. But now instead you could hold up the device and then you could reveal, the dust that he'd planted on the chairs, the cobwebs that he'd put around the curtains. You can see the stain effect on the ceiling. And so that level of detail is kind of lost to people that are there. So that kind of context is something that we're really excited by. When he first pitched it to us, he was saying he was aiming for the Great Gatsby meets The Shining. And I think he did a really, really good job at that. And so since that exhibition's ended, it's actually been fully removed, the walls are painted over, but now we have these little snapshots online for anyone to jump in and walk through on your phone or in virtual reality. Cool, so moving on a bit. So that's a really good, hopefully really good example of how AR can connect us with place, but that's only one part of the equation, right? So how does AR connect us with each other? And so we were contacted by Google's AR core team 2 years ago, and they opened up some early access to some software called Cloud Anchors. And so Cloud Anchors now actually helps our phones connect and orient themselves in a shared environment. And so we can now actually use AR to actually collaborate and co-create. And so we ran a cheeky 1-month sprint, and we created a fun AR application called ShareVox, and then just threw it in the hands of some street artists and had them creating these little 8-bit cubic voxelized worlds, which is a really fun example. And Google loved it. They actually shared it at their Google I/O conference that same year. And so that not only was a good kind of insight in terms of how the AR technology is becoming more human, but it actually opened up a really interesting channel for us to start collaborating with Google in a more direct, linear fashion. And so I want to start, before we jump into Rewild, talking a little bit about its predecessor called Into the Wild. So Into the Wild launched in 2017 inside the Art Science Museum in Singapore. And effectively what it did is it created a museum exhibition within the space between the museum's exhibitions. And so what you could do is you could actually walk around the hallway of the museum, and as you moved through it, you saw a jungle come to life around you. You'd meet orangutans and lions, and then you'd see the impact of a lot of the illegal deforestation that's happening in the Sumatran rainforest. And then you'd end the experience planting a seed. And at the end of that experience, if you planted a seed, that would actually translate to a real tree being planted in the real world. And so at the time, it was actually running on a device called Google Tango, and it's got some additional sensors in it that you can see here. And interestingly, that technology now is available on every single smartphone. So we're actually using software to jump forward in terms of what's possible and make these experiences more compelling and engaging, right? The only challenge that existed at that point in time with Into the Wild was it was effectively trapped in the museum. It was built around the footprint of the museum, so it couldn't quite get out. And so when Google and the Art Science Museum and WWF were looking at what's that next chapter, it was a really good opportunity to think about how we could scale these types of AR experiences. And so back in 2019, WWF and Netflix were working on a new series called Our Planet. I'm not sure if anyone's seen it here. It's an incredible 8-part series, and it really just focuses on Earth's biomes and actually reveals a story around how interconnected they all are, how one is so codependent upon the next. And so what was interesting as well, working with David Attenborough, this is the first time really that he was really active in terms of calling out the impact of climate change and the devastating loss that we are suffering as a species, right? So this really set the tone and the undercurrent for the project moving forward. And so we received a brief right at the end of 2018, and this is really the precedent, right? So it's something that I imagine many of us are really feeling right now in this room, and that's really simple, right? We know that nature needs a new deal. Whatever we're doing right now doesn't seem to be working, and it's only going to come back to bite us in the butt. And so this is based on the Living Planet report, and it was really simple. In the last 40 years, we've lost more than 60% of the world's wildlife population. And we have a window of time right now, a decade, the next 10 years, to basically reduce our carbon footprint by 50%. Pretty big call to action. And the good news is, though, is that we know the solutions. We know what we need to do. We just need to act now. And so when we started going through the content and listening to some of the episodes, we actually heard David Attenborough call out this concept of to rewild. And obviously we can prevent the loss of nature, but we now need to help restore the loss of nature. And so this was really the ethos that was ingrained into this project, and it really kicked off a really fun and exciting journey. And then we'll talk a little bit around the social aspects, right? So this is the premise for the whole experience, right? See the beauty of nature, see the impact that we're having on nature, take action together to then rewild nature. Really simple. And so we pitched an idea that was actually based off the foundation of our digital twin work. And the way that it worked was an experience where you could actually come together and collectively make a decision around what ecosystem you wanted to explore, and then work together to rewild it. And so the way that it works is you'd navigate around a semicircle platform, and then you'd stand on the quadrant that you wanted, and then a simple popularity vote would then determine the experience that we get to go and see. Really fun and a novel new user experience. And then we started looking at the installation, right? Like, we're a software and content company, but then we started building some physical stuff as well. And so we had these ingredients in terms of 4K projections, a platform that we could overlay the AR content into the space, and then we had a crater in the center that actually helped the phone orient itself within that environment. And then the last piece was really to think about how we could augment it. How could we take that AR content and break it free from the screen and bring it to life around the users, right? And so those were really the ingredients that we were working with. And then we just kicked into gear, right? So the one thing that we wanted to try and do was to elevate the level of quality from a low poly style of content to 3D media. And so a lot of these assets we actually, in the trailer here, are actually the same assets that we generated to then run in AR. And so the original scope for the project was to run it in Singapore with the WWF Singapore team and the Art Science Museum there. And it was an amazing opportunity for us to actually connect with WWF's team, who are really at the coalface for this fight against climate change, right? And so it was inspiring to see their view and their hope for the planet. And that really changed the way that we think and the way that we really ran headfirst into this. And so then alongside WWF, Google came to the table, right? So we were working with the Google APAC creative technology team, and they started opening up some new software. So there's some new stuff that you'll see coming out in the next few months around depth and persistence. And so now our phones can actually, map and understand objects within your space and then augment content around you. So you can see here the tiger hiding behind the bush and things along those lines. And it's exciting, right? Because our devices are becoming more contextually aware in the same way that we are. And that's something that we're really keen to keep tapping into. And this is a really interesting moment for us when the whole gravity of the project really sunk in, right? So we, about 2 months before the Our Planet series was launching, were getting these early, edits of the episodes themselves. And watermarked at the bottom of each episode was private, confidential, for PHORIA only. And that was when we were really shitting ourselves, because we were like, if we were to leak this series, it's probably going to be the end of PHORIA as we know it. So fortunately, we're good at keeping secrets. And yeah, nothing went online, so that was good. But through this experience, we really focused on just 4 ecosystems. We would have loved to do them all, but we only had 3 months, and it was probably a 6-month project. And so from those 2D episodes, we pulled in a little snapshot of about a 10-minute mini episode from the hour. And then we focused on the content here. So these biomes on the right are actually 3D textures. We've rendered them in a parametric way, meaning that you can slide a scale and see the beauty of that biome, say the forest, or then you can see it ravaged, say through deforestation. And then we started just getting a simple framework, right? Oceans and overfishing, grasslands and overfarming, frozen and climate warming. And so from there, we started to also look at how we could actually embrace some of the values from the project, right? So we work with Arup, the engineering firm here, and also the Melbourne University Fab Lab. And we wanted to basically take the values from the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. And we started designing and CADing up a flat pack kit that you could basically pull apart and then assemble in a short period of time and take it anywhere in the world. And also through the manufacturing process, reduce the carbon footprint. And then the next step was actually this crater. We were planning a potential future for this project. We didn't just want it to live on for one fleeting moment. And so we worked with Hustwaite Butcher, a Melbourne fabrication studio here in Melbourne, and built out this AR crater from steel. It actually weighs a ton, but I was really thankful when we first launched in Singapore. I saw a kid run up and jump on it like it was a trampoline, and it passed the test, so that's also glad we put in the extra effort. And then I think just in general, right, this project had about 50 stakeholders. We're a small startup here in Australia trying to really tackle, the world internationally, but there were so many people behind us. And that helped us launch it to 3 cities across the world. So we took it from Singapore straight through to New York, and then actually to Bristol, which is the home of the Natural History Unit that made the Our Planet series. And so then from there, when we were running and rolling out the exhibition, we started to notice some unique eccentricities within each culture, right? So when we were in Singapore, it was a very grandiose building, a really beautiful installation, but it was actually being facilitated by WWF ambassadors. And we found that when their story came from them, you really felt like it was speaking from the heart. And there was this really beautiful layer of warmth that would come around their narrative, right? And then, meanwhile, we're in New York. We actually had a whole bunch of facilitators that were part-time Broadway actors. And so they had a very theatrical way and got everyone really amped up, and it was an amazing experience for kids as well. And then at the end, when we went to Bristol, right, and I'm sure not many people would have been to Bristol in this room, but it's an amazing city. It's actually like the Melbourne of the UK, it feels. And the staff that were running it were actually science educators. So they're actually already very much emotionally and cognitively invested in learning. And so you had biologists and zoologists and geologists. And when they would actually run the experience, when we stepped back and finally handed it over, you'd see them riffing on the script and adding in new questions and playing with the children in a way that was evocative and actually starting a discourse. And so that was actually the most powerful moment for me in this project. And I realized, technology, as amazing as it is, it's not the whole solution, right? Technology can augment us as humans, but we really need that human warmth to come around and really elevate it to a new level. And then at the end of each experience, we actually wanted to see if we could actually follow up. That was a really cool thing, but what am I going to do next? Are you actually going to do something about it, or are you going to switch off? And so we had a really interesting follow-up. It was just a call to action to use your voice. And so one of the unique things about the experience was actually having this collective space where you would actually leave your mark within the exhibition, and then the next person that would come in would see your voice that exists, and then over time you'd then see tens, if not thousands of people that have gone through this experience together. And so we wanted to communicate that sense of scale, where if ultimately we all come together and we put that collective pressure on the global leaders, that's when we have power and we don't feel disempowered as an individual anymore. And so we had about 30,000 people go through during that time, and it plugged into a broader campaign that's a part of Davos called Voices for the Planet. And so the journey hasn't stopped there, and so, what a crazy, absolutely insane start to the next decade that we've all been thrown into, right? So it's been a very much an affirming wake-up call and validation to explore how we can drive technology towards behavioural change for good, right? So there's a few really exciting opportunities where we've learnt a lot from those first activations, but they were far from perfect, right? Like, it was a creative concept, but then you launch it into the wild and you learn so much, and there's so much you can do. And so there's a few next horizon pieces that we have in place. Super excited. Rewild's going to be coming home to Melbourne Museum in the second half of this year. Super amped for that. And we want to level it up. So we're thinking about, how can we bring in multi-sensory experiences or run long-term research to better understand and quantify the impact of these types of experiences. And then the next step as well, so in March, we'll be actually doing an activation with Earth Hour internationally. And so one of the main takeaways was actually, how do we make it more affordable so anyone anywhere in the world could pop this up and start sharing this type of content. And so what we're aiming for is really about $2,000 of kit, and then we can get support from our hardware partners, and then we can have anyone anywhere in the world jumping through these experiences for a really fractional budget, which is super exciting. And so that's coming later in 2 months from now. And then Pause Fest, right? Like, this is incredible. We started in the startup alley 4 years ago, trying to communicate what VR was to a lot of people. and it's an honor to be here sharing our journey with you all right now. And so downstairs would be amazing if you want to come check it out and just give us feedback, right? Like, it's still an experiment. We're iterating on it. We're trying to take what started in a museum and make it, accessible in anyone's homes effectively. So we'd love to hear from you. And I guess just to wrap up as well, right? So working with WWF, I remember the first week back this year, we had a conference call, and the sound of defeat in their voices was just, your heart sunk to the bottom of your chest, because the world and the fight they're fighting for is, already hard enough, let alone to be, slammed sideways, right? And so through that process, we were looking at something which is known as the EPBC, which is the Environment Protection, Biodiversity and Conservation Act. Not many people would have heard of this, let alone I imagine many politicians. And so the EPBC is actually decided upon once every 10 years, and then it's left until the next decade to then come back and see how we can update our policies. And so when we were speaking with WWF, they were like, look, it's not going to get any better, but hopefully it doesn't get any worse. What a sad way to approach this kind of mindset, right? And so what do? Like, how do we actually share our voice and put that pressure on global leaders? And so right now, for the next 10 days, there's a forum online. It's a simple platform, a website that you can log in and say, I want to stand up for more progressive climate action, and whether it can be for the forests, for the ocean, whatever it might be, use your voice really quite simply. And so at the end of each Rewild experience, we're actually inviting people to just jump on the tablet and just share their voice. So really simple call to action. And for us, we're really keen to see if this is actually a mechanism that can help drive more support to these types of causes. Cool, and so I guess just wrapping up now, last week I was in Indonesia, and we were filming a VR project, and it was actually a really inspiring and uplifting moment because we were actually in one of the biggest marine protected areas in the world. And over the last 10 years, you've actually seen a 5 times regeneration of the wildlife in the ocean. And it's a really good example, right? Like, we don't need some technological fandangled innovation to come and heal the ocean. We somewhat just need to get out of the way a little bit and let the ocean heal itself, right? And so on the last day, we're sitting on the beach at night time, and we looked up into the stars, and all of a sudden we saw this streak. It was about 30 lights going across us overhead, and it's nothing, no one had ever seen anything like that before. And we're like, what the hell is this? And then shortly after, we figured out that it was Elon Musk's Starlink, right? So if anyone's across it, Elon Musk has been launching about 300 satellites into space currently, and each week they're launching another 30 satellites. And so what they're trying to do is actually create a interconnected mesh of internet. And they're trying to deliver it at a speed that's about 5 times faster than the NBN and at 1/10 of the price. And so if you think about these types of innovations, right, we can actually uplift 1/3 of the world's population that currently don't have access to the internet. So it's really inspiring to think the impact that that could have on cultures, right? Like, we were out in these islands, and the best they had was a shortwave radio to communicate to someone. But what if they could talk to their family on the other side of the world, or even just back at their village? And so it was inspiring and really exciting. But then at the same time, we were thinking about, these amazing innovations. The journey that we are on as a species is incredible. But often you got to ask yourself, at what cost is these types of actions that we're, pursuing? We're reaching for the stars, we're aiming for Mars, we're trying to get off the planet. But then what are we really doing to help protect and sustain life here within the ecosystem that we're all thriving in today? And so just with that in mind, just really encourage you to reach for the stars, go for it, but don't forget where you came from.